Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Sara Marcus, assistant professor of English at Notre Dame University and the author of the new book, Political Disappointment, A Cultural History from Reconstruction to the AIDS Crisis. Professor Sara Marcus, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you for having me. I'm pleased to be here.
So one of the things that I hadn't thought about until I received your book and started reading your book is that the history of politics really is a history of political disappointment for the most part. There is a lot of disappointment, isn't there?
Yes, there is. And one of the reasons that I focus my book on the 20th century, and the 20th century, which I have as beginning sort of in the aftermath of Reconstruction, right at the end of the Civil War, there's this opportunity, which to all observers at the moment was a real opportunity to have a do-over with the United States and say, okay, we had that early part of the history of this country. It's based on slavery, based also on colonialism, settler colonialism, genocide of the original inhabitants, and so forth. That wasn't really addressed in the wake of the Civil War, but the question of racial equality, of this country as a multiracial democracy, there was an actual effort, an actual legislation, rewriting of the Constitution to change in what could have been like very strongly determinative ways, the whole makeup of this country and the whole basis upon which its promises of, liberty, equality, freedom, and so forth and so on were predicated. And in the aftermath of Reconstruction, that seeming opening shut back down. All right. And that, to me, is a kind of inaugural disappointment that sets in motion this cyclical thing that goes on throughout the course of the 20th century. And whether it goes on into the 21st is beyond the scope of the book, but I'm happy to get into it in the podcast and we should talk about it. But this cycle throughout the 20th century of, oh, yes, can this country be saved? Yes, we can. It can be done. We'll do it in this way. Well, that isn't working. We'll do it in this way. Well, that, we got some of the things and it didn't actually change so much. One of the keys of why starting the book at the aftermath of Reconstruction makes so much sense is because in some ways, the wished for thing arrived in a certain sense. The end of slavery, the arrival of freedom for the African Americans arrives, and yet it doesn't. Du Bois writes in The Souls of Black Folk, the freedman has not yet found in freedom his promised land. So what do you do when the thing sort of arrives, or in some other way, the window for getting something to change shuts down?
Now, I think it's so important to talk about Reconstruction because it's something that I didn't understand for a long time until I went to college and started taking Black Studies courses, because the story that I was told in high school U.S. history is the story of the Civil War as, the triumph of good over evil, the abolition of slavery. Reconstruction, I went to school in the South. Reconstruction kind of glossed over a little bit, and then I didn't really understand what you were just saying there about the fact that I know I had certainly heard things like so-and-so is the first Black official since Reconstruction. And then it starts to set in. You go, hang on, wait a second. There was a moment there where we almost had a democracy. And then it got snuffed out for 100 years. And how did people react to having glimpsed, all these people dead in the Civil War and thinking, well, now we're going to have a democracy. It looks like you can, for a moment, you have Black senators, Black state legislatures, and then it all gets snuffed out. So a lot of your book is about how do people respond to that. So with Reconstruction specifically, how does that affect people, that glimpse and then that loss?
It's so great. I mean, one of the things that it does is it reveals the problems with the conception of historical progress, primarily to Black Americans and to people who are paying attention way earlier than anybody else realizes that linear motion through history might be a total sham. There's this wonderful moment in Dusk of Dawn, the later memoir that Du Bois writes, where he writes about how in the years when he went to college in the late 19th century, it was the age of progress with a capital P, he writes. And there's so much technological change, and the United States is expansionist in a way that strikes many Americans as a positive thing. Oh, we're on the way up. And he writes, like, if it hadn't been for the fact that I was paying attention to what it's like for Black people, I probably would have bought it too, this progress thing. But because I knew that that wasn't the case for this whole facet of the population, I had a more complicated idea of how history works than most of the people around me in that moment of progress, which of course gives way to the progressive era in the United States history. So this is one of the things that it does is you find these Black thinkers at the beginning of the 20th century coming up with theories of history that can accommodate regression, backsliding, historical eddies, just this absolute failure of history to, go upward, even in a spiral or, like to go upward at all. Because right now, as people, Pauline Hopkins writes of people at this time are writing about how you're seeing atrocities now that would have seemed out of date 200 years earlier, right? Like the motion of time, like triumphantly into history is simply not happening.
Mm-hmm. I mean, with social movements sort of periodically arise, and often there's this kind of incredible moment where it seems like they're going to triumph. I've lived through a few of these myself, and I'm sure you've seen it firsthand too. I mean, I remember Occupy Wall Street in 2010, going down to see it in Boston and in New Haven, and seeing these Occupy encampments where they felt like this incredible new thing being born, people trying these experiments, and then the police clear the camp, people scatter, they end up in a lot of different places. The 60s, obviously, there's like a few years where a lot of people believe that they're going to give birth to an entire new kind of society, and then it's shattered, and then there's that backsliding you mentioned, there's the Reagan Revolution, and all of it is undone. But the people who've experienced that moment, they still have to go on with their lives, right? So many of them are young at the time. They might have another 50 years where they have to live with that disappointment. So what do people do with that disappointment?
That's great. So one of the things that's really central to my conception of disappointment in this book is that disappointment is a desire that's outliving the period of time when it might have been fulfilled. And when I say when it might have been fulfilled, I'm talking about this exact thing you're talking about, like the moment when you look at conditions around you and you're like, holy shit, we have a shot. This might really anything from holy shit, we have a shot to like, this is absolutely happening. The revolution is next week, or we've already created it at Zuccotti Park, and now it just has to sort of spread through osmosis, and we'll remake the whole world as a series of spokes councils with people's microphones and everything else. The fact that these desires don't go away when the encampment gets shut down. They don't go away when there are no more marches. The desires don't die, but they don't just survive in a sort of keep going, nevertheless you persisted sort of manner. Like there's a shift that goes on, there's a change. So that it feels different, right, to hold a desire that's been disappointed than to hold a desire in the mode of expectancy. And what you can do with that desire is different. If you want a new world and there's an encampment, Occupy Wall Street encampment in your town, or a Black Lives Matter march going on downtown because it's COVID shut down and like the downtowns are empty and you can just fill them with a demonstration. If it's one of those times, you go and do that. That's the practice that desire animates, that it brings out in you. And when you can't do those things, that desire animates other practices, right? You're disappointed, but what I've seen in the history of the 20th century for sure is that new concepts in literature and in art and in video and in sound and new kinds of practices, new ways of writing things, new ways of thinking about things come up and become like the new forms that these desires take on.
When I opened your book surprised me because I didn't expect so much of it to be about music. I did not anticipate this when I opened it, but it turns out that a lot of the ways that political disappointment tends to get channeled after the particular political goal sort of fades out of reach, oftentimes that it ends up, that feeling that you say persists, comes out in song quite a lot.
Yes, it comes out in music, and even more specifically, it comes out in what I call in the book transcriptions, and sometimes I call them choral transcriptions with a CH, not a C, like transcriptions that involve a chorus or some kind of a choral presentation. So by transcriptions, I mean these points where people try and write music down on a page, which of course is going to be not an exact translation because sound is not writing. Or moments when literature tries to encompass or approximate sound in any one of a number of formally inventive ways. Like these moments where you're trying to bridge a border between sound and writing, or between, to put it another way, between the sort of like expansive, feelingly boundary-less experience of being enveloped in a sound. So that's on the one side. And on the other side, the taking it down to some kind of a form, whether that's a recording that's on page, a recording that's on vinyl, whatever, like something in that seesaw, that balancing act, has a lot to do with disappointment, which is itself, after all, you had this boundless desire for a new world, your dreams for which were perhaps in excess of anything that could exist in 3 dimensions. And then how do you find a home for that, a specific home for that in the world and in art?
Maybe you could give our listeners a favorite example to help them a little better understand what you mean by how this particular feeling of disappointment, of frustration at the unaccomplished political goal can come out in sound.
Great. I'm happy to. And I was just listening. I know you did an episode a couple of months ago that dealt with the music of Leadbelly.
Oh, yeah.
That was such a great episode. And I deal with Leadbelly a lot in chapter 2, and specifically thinking about the way that he changes the way he's performing work songs right over the switching point when in the US, actually globally, the communist line that like revolution is about to come and, the militant worker will bring it about, that gets totally dropped around the middle of the 30s in favor of the Popular Front, which is a much more, we have to build alliances with Democrats and liberal groups, and we just have to stop fascism. I'm not in any way saying that it's a mistake to try and stop fascism. I'm just saying that there was an unacknowledgeable sense of loss in that moment when the idea of imminent revolution just vanishes pretty much from the like leftist set of ideas, and also the commitment to workers, and also especially to self-determination for Black workers, also gets shunted aside in favor of this big tent alliance building thing of the Popular Front. So in the middle, across this shift, which dates to 1934 and 35, Leadbelly, who has been performing some work songs ever since his release from prison, ever since his working with John Lomax and then breaking with John Lomax and going on to a career of his own in New York, performing largely for leftist audiences, he starts to include this sort of like sharp out-breath in his work songs at the point in the song where a work team might have been letting the hammer fall. And what's so interesting about this is that it's at this exact same time, transcriptions of those sounds, which had been manifest throughout published transcriptions of folk songs and Black songs since the beginning of those transcriptions, they disappear from the transcriptions. So at this point where people who are writing down, either they're writing it with a sort of like X note head with a note stem, or they're writing it as a note stem with no note head, or they're distinguishing it from a sung word by underlining it, and they're writing either ha H-U-H or ha H-A-H or ha H-A-N-A. There's no standardized transcription of it at all, which I find absolutely fascinating. And then they just stop trying at this moment when an interest in the actual scene of manual labor and the actual person and embodied manual worker is not as important anymore to left-wing thought. And it's at this point that Leadbelly actually introduces it into his recordings. And there aren't really live recordings from this period. They're all sort of recordings made in a studio, given the limitations of recording technology at that time. So we can only guess that he's also doing it at performances that he's giving for audiences. But we definitely know that in the recordings, he starts to go take this hammer, ha, and carry it to the captain, ha, All right. And that comes in. So that to me is a practice of trying to keep alive this idea of the embodied worker as important, as worthy of cultural space, keep that alive at the very moment that it's being really sidelined or even erased, both from written transcriptions and from political ideas.
Mm-hmm. How else do you see? I mean, I assume every time there is a social movement that has this familiar pattern of seeing a transformative goal come tantalizingly within reach, only to be snuffed out. Those participants, many of them, because of the type of people who get involved in movement activity, tend to be plenty of poets and other writers and musicians and artists. I assume there are sort of many examples of how these people post movement end up kind of using their work to process their feelings about that frustrated ambition.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that history goes back way farther than Reconstruction. I mean, a whole lot of romantic poetry in the wake of the French Revolution is devoted to precisely this. But in more recent work, in the work that I deal with in the book, we get examples such as I've been talking a lot about the early part of the century, so I'm going to think about some of the later examples that we have. We have, for example, in a talk given at a conference in the early 80s by the feminist poet Adrienne Rich. The title of the talk is like Motherhood, the Current Emergency, and the Quantum Leap. The backlash is setting in. All of these advances of feminism of second wave feminism in the 70s are under attack from the right in a way that feels extremely familiar now. And she talks about the backlash and the emergency. And this isn't a poem, of course, it's a talk, but I find it fascinating that she talks at this point, like, what's been effective for feminists so far has been talking to and hearing each other. And that was a process that was largely happening with, people sitting together in a room. This is my gloss. She's talking about the consciousness raising process, which by and large happened with people sitting together in a room. And she's saying, so let us commit then to fling cables of recognition across the differences that divide us. In the same gesture that she's trying to say, talking to and listening to each other can still help. She doesn't want to admit that everything has changed. She wants to hold on to something that steadies the course from a previous moment, which can sometimes be a misguided goal, but she's trying to do this. But even in the moment of doing this, she's like, now I realize, though, that some kind of mediation, flinging a cable of recognition, you're thinking about like a telegraph cable going across an ocean, perhaps. She's recognizing that the process is going to have to be different, and it's going to have to account for differences in a much more robust way than it was. Now, in the chapter that I talk about Rich, I also talk about these two poems. This one poem that Rich writes, and then a poem that Audre Lorde writes a couple of years later, responding to Rich's poem. And basically, I don't want to say that Lorde's poem calls out, quote unquote, Rich, because it's not as easily like a gotcha moment. She more sort of takes an image that Rich is using. Rich is in this poem, the image is writing about pornography. It's at this like really powerfully anti-porn moment in the second wave feminist movement, where the second wave feminists confronted with backlash are like, maybe we can, maybe anti-porn is the issue that will sort of like unite lots of women again. Spoiler alert, that didn't work. But so Rich is writing about like pornographic images as a sort of lynching. This is her words. And Lorde, in response, I would say, writes a poem that's actually about Emmett Till and about lynching, and compares the images of his body that were widespread in the summer of his killing, compares those pictures to a raped woman, to say this idea of that lynching is just available as a metaphor for any sort of like spectacular violence that you are upset about doesn't really work, because lynching is actually lynching. And then Lord goes beyond that and, does this incredible work of like historical juxtaposition and superimposition in this poem, which is called After Images, in which she's watching a white woman on the news lamenting a flooded river that had sort of destroyed her house. And Lord, in her imagination, sort of sees this woman as related to the woman whose accusation doomed Emmett Till to death, and thinking about the idea that the river, and through the river, Emmett Till is sort of taking his revenge, but also seeing both of these women as being as much, I'm trying to think about whether to use the word victims of patriarchy or just being as much constrained by patriarchy and by the things that the men in their lives want them to say, as they are themselves also, agents of this, deadly, like, white woman Karenism, what we would now call white woman Karenism. Obviously, that's not what Lord says.
Yeah, well, we're talking about this idea of, the many, many different ways in which people can participate in a movement that is frustrated, and then you notice as you examine the body of their work from the rest of their lives what that political disappointment is, how it's manifesting in the things that they're writing. I mean, I'm fascinated by the question because I feel like I'm living this a little bit as someone who, was excited by the Occupy movement, excited by the Bernie Sanders campaign in my case. And what do you do when your movement disappears, I think? And so, you've looked at all these people. What do they do when their movement disappears?
Yes. What do you do when your movement disappears? One of the main things that people do when their movements either disappear or face such profound setbacks that the movement no longer exists in a form that you recognize as being the movement that you were involved with before, people take a long view. One of the very first things that people do if they're really confronting their disappointment, as opposed to denying it by saying, okay, we're just going to like go do this thing instead and it's the same thing, or disavowing it by saying, oh, I was dumb to even be involved with that. I ought to have known. That's the disillusionment wing, which, is prominent, not part of my book, but a big deal, especially in narratives of like the aftermath of the old left, the communist left in the US. If people are really confronting their disappointment, one of the first things that they do is realize that the time scale of the struggle they're in is much, much, much longer than they had any way of grasping when they were in the heat of the moment. And that's not just an abstract thing of like, oh yes, history is longer and this will take us longer or whatever. It also really takes the form of intergenerational connections and trying to imagine your own voice as sounding out to future generations and understanding yourself as being accountable in some ways to a set of ancestors, that your disappointment is the very thing that links you to them.
Yeah, because, we're here in 2023, and as we look back on a lot of movements that ultimately did succeed in achieving at least some of their major aims, the disappointment part of the story can disappear from view because it does seem, in the long time scale, like a triumph. I think particularly of your interesting inclusion of the AIDS activist movement. I just want to read a little quote from you here. You say, some might wonder what a discussion of the AIDS activist movement, an effort commonly discussed as a success, is doing in a book on political disappointment. Triumphalist narratives about AIDS activism abound, and yet these tend to erase activists as stakeholders who remained outside the networks of power and ignore populations for whom the development of expensive antiretroviral therapies has still not put an end to the AIDS crisis. So we have talked about frustrated social movements, but even what look like successful social movements can, if we decompose them into the particular people who are part of, they can succeed for some people and not for others. Or we can also miss an understanding of what it felt like to be in the period of time where things felt completely hopeless.
Right. That's interesting. That's sort of the two sides of the coin of the inclusion of ACT UP and AIDS activism in the book. One is, as you said, the AIDS activist movement succeeded in making treatments that extend in really meaningful ways the lifetimes of people with HIV as long as they are economically and socially situated to access those medications. And that's a great triumph. It's not a complete triumph because those medications aren't equally available. But there was also a part of the AIDS activist movement that aimed not just to save the lives of people with AIDS and HIV by speeding up the generation of new treatments, but also to redo the healthcare system in the United States so that access to healthcare wouldn't be so unequal. Clearly, that was not a success despite their best efforts. One of the things that I write about in the book is how when the AIDS epidemic came up, it was a real wake up call for people that Stonewall and the post Stonewall gay liberation movement had not actually succeeded in securing for LGBTQ plus humans in the US equal access to respect and dignity in the eyes of the culture and the government as a whole, right? You know, we had thought we had achieved some sort of equality, and yet as soon as there's a mysterious illness that is wiping us out, other people don't care because it's not touching them. All right. And so a goal to actually secure recognition, human recognition for people across a spectrum of genders and sexualities was another aim of the AIDS activist movement that it seemed for a long time in the 90s had been successful. And it's only in recent years that the sort of vulnerability of those wins, as we see, you know, with Target being pressured to remove Pride Month merchandise from its stores, right? This is not a full victory, even as so often we think, oh, well, here's, you know, one of the only successful social movements of the past 50 years has been the movement for, you know, gay equality. Well, it's been, you know, movement for gay equality for people who are able to, in every other way, access the tokens of respectability according to, you know, who in America is considered worthy of that kind of respect. Anyway, so that's part one. And then part two is what you said, that even as the AIDS activist movement did have these pretty substantial successes by the mid 90s, in the late 80s and early 90s, it didn't feel like that. It felt the opposite because they had done all this organizing and people were still dying. And Douglas Crimp writes about this in a piece that I quote in the book, that they had done so much great organizing and it felt like everything was coming together and it felt like this magnificently revolutionary movement. And still, they're just going to funeral after funeral. And this despair starts to sink in of like, is anything that we're doing working? And it's valuable, as I think you were pointing out, to notice what is going on in that moment. And also to realize that that moment sometimes can precede some meaningful success, right? The fact that you're disappointed in a moment doesn't actually mean that everything you're doing was necessarily lost. It might be, it might not be. Hard to really know in the moment. What can help is connecting with the people who felt that way in previous eras and understanding ourselves as part of a longer history of disappointment.
Something that I think is very interesting about your book is that from one perspective, you reach some conclusions that seem to mark you as more pessimistic than others. I just read from your coda here, you say that you've argued that political disappointment was the defining political experience of the 20th century in the United States. Now, that sets you apart from triumphalists like, for example, Professor Steven Pinker, who might argue that the story of the 20th century is a story of wonderful human progress. But I say this, but then you say that the shared experience of loss offered grounds for solidarity across difference, and in the recurrent rhythms of disappointment and the ongoing efforts to cope with non-fulfillment, this book's archive demonstrates, I'm going to use a wonderful phrase of yours here, the paradoxical generativity of a loss. And so there is that paradox where, as you say, you know, you are looking back on some things that people might regard as triumphs and pointing out the element of strong disappointment in them. But maybe you could tell us a little more about this concept of the generativity of loss.
Yes, I'm happy to. I wrote this book over many, many years. And for many of the first years, I really resisted coming up with any like silver lining to loss and disappointment because I was writing against what I saw in some other thinkers who I really respected and took a lot of inspiration from. But I was noticing this sort of inclination to take anything negative and like right away repackage it as, you know, a way forward or a way to learn lessons or whatever. And I was really fighting against that. And I think that it's funny that by the end of the book, I could no longer, having gone to the archive and seeing what other people made of it, I could no longer deny that this was a big part of how people dealt with disappointment and that these were the things that survived, right? The sort of minimalist claim I began with was out of disappointment, people make cultural texts and practices that endure and that survive longer than whatever movement sparked the disappointment in the first place. That was going to be my really mini claim. But I realized that it's much more than that for the people I'm writing about. Like, they do see how confronting loss makes space for other things to open up. Now, does that necessarily mean that the movement that failed last year is going to succeed next year in the next 5 years? Like, no. And I would have loved to have found that, but it doesn't quite work that way. But the cultural records that people produce out of disappointment, and not just that, but the communities, the senses of being together with others in your own moment and also forward and backward through history. These are the things that a properly focused encounter with loss opens up. And that changes how you live in the present, whether or not you ever get to see capitalism overthrown or, settler colonialism undone and all the land given back and everything else. It changes what you do now.
I think in that answer, you've given a little bit of of an answer to what was going to be my final question, but which I will still put to you, which is, what have you discovered that can offer counsel to the disappointed?
I mean, the biggest thing, and this may be, lukewarm comfort at best, but it's a sense that being disappointed connects you to a lineage of people who wanted to change the whole world and were disappointed in it. And not just that you're connected to people in the past and and that what you have to say might speak to the future. Although, to me, honestly, when I arrived at that, writing the final chapter, I felt better thinking about that. I felt better listening to this audio tape of David Wojnarowicz driving through the desert in New Mexico after receiving his AIDS diagnosis, knowing his time on Earth is quite likely limited, turning on the radio and hearing Tracy Chapman singing Fast Car, an amazing anthem of disappointment, and turning on his handheld tape recorder to talk along with and in between the lines of Tracy Chapman's song, thinking about his friends who are dead, who can't hear this song, and that he's listening on behalf of them, and he's also understanding that he'll be dead soon too. He says at the end, like, a long, long road in front of me and a long, long road in the rearview mirror, and everything feels pretty great. Like, there is something consoling about understanding that your disappointed moment is not all there is.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I always try to think, however devastating my own feelings of political disappointment may be, as I say, I'm really glad you begin this book with Reconstruction, because I feel like there could be no more terrible and crushing, violent disappointment than the birth of a multiracial democracy in this country, only to see it viciously extinguished for 100 years, that people had to wait in order to have their aspiration even marginally fulfilled. So yes, I think this...
And the white supremacy continues to shape so much of our policy today. In a way, we could say that we haven't remade the country as a multiracial democracy yet. And it's difficult to imagine that it ever would be. But to see how these windows of possibility open and close throughout history can at least give us a better sense of perspective on where we are now.
Well, for that better perspective, people should pick up the book Political Disappointment, A Cultural History from Reconstruction to the AIDS Crisis. Professor Sara Marcus, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you so much for having me, Nathan. It's been a wonderful conversation.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.